Says it's live.
Did we do it? Are we here?
We're never
It says we're live. All right. Alexander Davis, I'm so excited. I am also excited. Jacob Horn, who's on PTO, is typically the one who pushes all of these buttons. So the fact that we made it to the internet today is quite the feat. As you can see, next to me on this side of the screen, we have a new guest, Caleb Leidy, lead assessor here at Summit 7 Systems. He is going to be stepping up to the good old Jacob plate today for our CUI hotline, and we can answer any and all of your assessment-related questions. So make sure to drop those in chat as we go through today. And yeah, looking forward to chatting with you all today. Caleb, thanks for joining. Give us a little background. Who are you, my friend?
Who am I?
Who are you? Existential question here.
In terms of CMMC, I like to say I've been around kind of since the beginning of it, right? I had a stint in the Navy, 6 years as a cryptologic technician in the Navy, which led into a contracting position at Defense Contract Management Agency, where I did security assessments and risk assessments there. It's been about 5 years on that contract, and that team that I was supporting on the government side is the team that created the DIBCAC. So I switched to what at the time I called the dark side. For the time that I was with them, I stopped referring to them as that. And now I'll call it dark side again, since I'm back out. But spent a little bit of time with the DIBCAC, about 1.5 years, 2 years. Became a lead assessor with them, went through things like COVID, figuring out virtual assessments for the first time, those types of things. Have had all of the debates on what's good enough and not good enough from the DIBCAC perspective. And, it got a little monotonous and a little difficult to kind of keep going out every other week and telling companies, hey, you didn't do this right, and not being able to answer the question, well, how do I do it right? So I wanted to kind of bring that out and have the ability to answer that question. So I spent another 1.5 years with a consulting firm, and then a position opened up here at Summit 7 about 2.5 years ago, a little over 2.5 years ago. So I joined Summit 7. We've now got an entire compliance department that I run. We've got a whole team of CCAs and CCPs and really, really awesome people that work together in conjunction with our MSP. And it's been going really great. So excited.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And we've hit 29 CMMC L2 certified companies, clients that we work with. You've had a big hand in that. Your team's had a big hand in that. So thank you for supporting them through all the joint surveillance, through the actual commercial assessments, because that's been a heavy lift. And we're going to talk about some of the things that pop up in these assessments today, kind of as we're going through the live stream here. But before we get started any further, tried and true thought of the week, Caleb. So you and I talked a little bit earlier today on what your thought of the week is, and I don't know the context of it, so I'm pretty excited about this. ESP inheritance is 100% irrelevant. Please, what in the world does this even mean?
So that may be a little dramatic, right? But for effect, obviously you want to know what your ESPs are doing. There's been a lot of debates on LinkedIn and out on the internet about whether or not an ESP can give you 100% inheritance for your CMMC Level 2 certification. Those claims have been made. Those claims have been argued against. The Cyber AB specifically came out and said that that's not possible. Same kind of deal, right, on things like whether CMMC is going to happen, right? That's another one that's been just super hot. So overall, my intent with this and my thought of the week here is that if we're focusing on those kinds of things, right, the question of whether or not you can get 100% inheritance from an MSP or other ESP is so irrelevant to actually getting ready for an assessment, right? Actually putting these controls in place. And that's why I liken it to the debate over whether CMMC is going to happen, right? It's like we have the DFARS 7012. The requirements are there. So whether CMMC is going to happen doesn't matter. If you're going through and preparing for an assessment, I will tell you, even if you have an ESP that claims 100% inheritance, you got to figure out how, and you have to be able to relay that to an assessor. So that also, I feel like, is irrelevant, right? There's so much preparation and things that have to get done. So if we're just, debating over these things that are high level, program level things of whether I have to do this or whether there's an easy button, like if you're having those debates, you're not spending the time getting ready for an assessment, right? So we see it like with our organization, people that are, helping companies get ready, but for any DIB organization that actually has to implement these things and go get certified, that part is really not all that important to actually going in and starting to get the work done.
We were having the debate last week where Jacob had brought it up that, can I have a POAM going into an assessment? It's like, these are what I would call luxury questions, right? It's like, if you figured out everything, now you're just debating the theory of it. Like, but yourself, you're ready to go through an actual assessment, right? And that's where it comes down to. It's like, once you've gone through it, let's debate all the fun stuff, right? Do you actually have to do this? Do you not? But like, make sure that you're ready and don't just like spend your time on the fringes trying to like debate the things that in the reality will not help you end up passing an assessment, right? Cyber Ninja, good question. Remind me what ESP stands for again. External service provider. So this could be like MSPs, MSSPs. We're even seeing it come into place with like law firms and other service delivery organizations that are like outside counsel, right? So we're even seeing some very interesting handling from like a support perspective and how their systems have to be maintained because they do e-discovery and things like that. If they're not doing just traditional subcontracting work on behalf of a contract. So yeah, the ESP is an external organization supporting you in your CMMC journey is what that stands for there. That's a good question. All right. My thought of the week here, Caleb. I have a lot of conversations with people that are like, Daniel, for the love of God, like, I just want to do an enclave. I want to be done with this CMMC thing. I want to check the box. And I say, you know what? Good for you. Let's put you in an enclave. But let's first figure out where is that CUI that you have and can it fit in an enclave, right? And so that's the biggest crux of everything. I've been talking to a company about 1,600 users, half here based in the US, half overseas. And the question kind of got brought up. They're like, oh, we need to do an enclave for like a couple hundred people. And I'm like, well, do you know where your CUI is? Well, we have some people in Europe, EU working with it, mostly here in America. And it comes down to like, it's okay to build an enclave. But my recommendation for everyone, in parallel at the very least, do a CUI scoping project. So at the very end of it, you have high confidence that all of your CUI has a path forward to become compliant, right? When it comes to this. And that's kind of the interesting kind of phenomenon here. CUI pre-DFARS 7021 isn't contractually obligated for CMMC certification, right? This is a new world that we will live in October of this year, where any of those new contracts will require that CUI to be protected. But you can see all your legacy CUI, I'll call it, that you still have to protect to DFARS 7012. That's going to give you a really good blueprint and data flow and idea of, okay, what is everything that has to be compliant once I actually have to attest to keeping it all in a certified boundary, right? So CUI scoping is still very, very important. I know a lot of people are rushing to try and build an enclave to check the box. Please, at the very least, do the efforts in parallel. Don't just build an empty enclave when you rightfully know that you have more data that cannot fit into an enclave, right? So when you win a contract, you don't want to go and have to do a significant change and then maybe trigger another CMMC certification after you already just got certified. So anyways, all the fun things, all the rabbit holes. So yeah, it's just kind of crazy when you actually go out there, right?
It's another easy button,
It's another easy button. Scoping is indeed important. Do this first before looking at the controls. Absolutely. Where does the data go? And I say this time and time again. I was on a conversation this week with a company, and they asked me to do an executive brief. This was a technical team. And they said, I don't think our executives understand the burden of CMMC. Like, they just say, hey, IT, go fix the problem. And I was like, oh, yeah, that happens a lot, sadly. But the other side of that is IT has to know and be prescribed, where is the problem, right? AKA, where is the data? So it's like IT doesn't know that. They're supporting the core systems underneath the whole corporate enterprise, right? They're not data hunters. They're not in every business unit saying, how do you handle this data, right? A business unit says, hey, I need this application. They go through change control. They get it approved. They deploy it. They maintain it. And that's it. That's how it works. So be nice to your IT people. Make sure your executives understand what's going on. And it has to be the whole business buying into this CMMC thing, because to Wendy's point here, you have to know data flow, where it's processed, where it's stored, where it's transmitted. And to take a step further, if you're dealing with export control, now you've got to look at personship or potentially citizenship stacked on top of the CUI and all sorts of fun stuff to go with that. So,
and a lot of that comes down to like reading, right?
Absolutely.
I think you mentioned it before that Ryan Bonner is one that says, yeah, I just outread everybody else. Right.
That's it.
And it really is, or even working with somebody, like we get clients ready all the time. And that's exactly where we start, is scoping. But even before that, a discovery, right? Understand it, taking an inventory of everything that you have, and then being able to scope it down. Because we've done that too, right? We started with scoping. We say, all right, here's your 5 asset types. Let's talk about which ones fit into this category. And if you're working with somebody who's not an expert in the field and hasn't taken a great amount of time to dig into this stuff, it's like, well, here's what I think you said a CUI asset is, and here's what I think mine are. And then you get all the way through, doing an internal assessment, a gap assessment or something, and they're like, oh, actually, I think my ERP probably fits into that as well.
Yeah.
You're like, what ERP?
Right. That it's funny you say that. So one of those conversations this week, the technical team comes and says, hey, can you just validate that our ERP isn't in scope? And I said, well, is there CUI in it? They're like, no. Well, then, okay, it's not in scope. Like, we can confidently say no CUI equal no scope, right? And then they went back to their executives, and their business had hired 2 other consulting kind of CUI companies to help them determine, and CMMC prep companies. And those people came back and said, no, it's got to be in, like, you've got to keep it in scope. And I fire back, I'm like, you don't have to keep it in scope. There's no CUI. And they're like, well, but there might end up being CUI in it. I'm like, well, that changes the narrative though. It's like, you've got to lock in and understand. Again, CMMC is not an IT problem, right? That's good. They're more of a binary, right? 1 or 0. Make it compliant or not.
Or like, hey, I took the client name out of the files, so it's not CUI anymore.
Right. It's like, oh, also doesn't work. Nice try. It's like, it's like, oh, we attach, things to POs and invoices, and it's like, oh, that's, that could be a problem, So yeah, you're right. It starts spiraling really quick if you don't do that well. Because here's the thing. If you go and get CMMC certified and it's not all encompassing of the boundary you plan to perform the work in, and you end up with CUI outside of the boundary, we're back into the world of false claims, just in a different world. Instead of representing your SPURS score, you're misrepresenting your compliance boundary, right? And the assets that should be in scope. So it's a slippery slope. You're not going to get away from it. That's why it has to be so certain that you and the business are collectively bought in to doing this the right way, which it just goes back to scoping time and time and time again. Yeah, sure. Bruce, to your point, the I in CIO stands for information. Yes. Knowing where that information is pretty pivotal to being able to do their job, and then passing that down through the team. So, all right, here we go. I had this one come up in a call, and in our Ask an Assessor CUI Hotline edition here today. What does an assessor look at FedRAMP look at for FedRAMP moderate equivalent clouds? Is it risky to use these? So if you were to come in, Caleb, someone had a FedRAMP moderate equivalent cloud, what are you going to do as an assessor? Like, what do you have to look at? Like, what are your recommendations? Like for clients that use these tools, like what evidence do they need to proactively gather, or what they refer to as a body of evidence in this world? Kind of help us out here a little bit.
And there's a big difference between FedRAMP moderate authorized, right? You have ATO or provisional ATO, and equivalent, right? Personally, I hate the entire concept of equivalence, particularly the DoD's implementation of what that needs to look like. You know, we have a lot of organizations that are good cloud providers with good security practices that are not eligible to enter into the FedRAMP process.
And the reason that is they don't have sponsorship from a government agency.
Right. They don't have sponsorship from a government agency, and a lot of them never will, right? And then on top of that, when you do have that sponsorship and you go through it and get an ATO, now you have an authorizing official that can accept risk for things that are not implemented on that baseline. Well, equivalency, you're outside of that process. There's no authorizing official that can accept any risk. So what they've said is you have to have 100% compliance. You cannot have POAMs that result from your 3PAO assessment. So it's really, really difficult in my time in government dealing with RMF and FedRAMP, those types of things. I don't think I've seen a system that had no open POAMs, right? Everything relies on risk acceptance from an authorizing official. So that aside, right, there are pretty clearly laid out. I think for FedRAMP authorized clouds, everything is pretty well accepted these days, right? We've kind of gotten to the point where we know they've been through that process. The government has okayed it from the FedRAMP stance, and you can accept the things that are in there as validated both by an independent 3PAO and the government themselves. For equivalent, there is still a check process. I think it goes through the DIBCAC, but there's more of a burden of providing evidence. So that entire body of evidence, which is essentially an ATO package that you would submit for FedRAMP, is going to be needed, and somebody has to check off on that. An assessor should not be going through and reassessing that, FedRAMP package in an assessment, but they will look at whether they've gone through the proper process for the government to consider them FedRAMP moderate equivalent, and then that can be accepted. So it really happens in the scoping and the lead up to an assessment, and I think it's called out in the CAP specifically that if you don't have that evidence prepared, then you're essentially not moving forward with the assessment. Anything that cloud provider is responsible for at that point is considered not met.
And I would be curious, like, because of the extra time it takes to have to do that due diligence to validate all of that documentation's collected, I wonder if assessors charge more if people are using equivalent clouds. I haven't actually seen pricing around if that's a variable or not, but yeah, it's interesting. It's one of those things where, to your point, not every cloud provider the government wants to use, but they're good cloud providers, right? And it's like, you have to do this equivalency, which is actually harder than the actual FedRAMP authorization, which is wild, right? Because of that, I really just think that, and Scott and Jacob, we've all kind of joked about this, like the DoD is just trying to kill equivalency, right? They're basically just moving in the direction, the FedRAMP 20XX, accelerator program kind of thing, trying to get more companies in and things like that. I hope it takes off. I'm cautiously optimistic about all of that, because there needs to be more tools that are able to be compliant for a lot of different industries. We work with a lot in construction. Bluebeam is a huge tool. The government's probably not going to procure Bluebeam SaaS version, right? It's like, but construction companies need it. and they're building things in defense installations, right? And so,
Yep.
anyways, that's a really good answer. And guess what? You got a little emoji from old Jacob Horn here. I think that's what is that? A banana? I think that's a banana.
Oh yeah.
Jacob, we hope you're enjoying your PTO, my friend. Happy to know you're tuned in and watching. Like and subscribe, Jacob. Thank you. We had a couple of questions as we were talking through this. One from Alexander Davis. What is SPRS? Take it away, Caleb.
It's the Supplier Performance Risk System. That's essentially where you are attesting to your level of compliance, your scores, whether from an official assessment or an internal assessment. It's the government's tracking system for suppliers, right? And how you're performing on meeting contract requirements. I don't know if it expands a lot beyond, specifically the 7012 compliance, things of that nature, and now into CMMC. I know just from my time at DCMA, there's a lot of other, I think it was actually called CPRS, assessments that would be done, right? That Defense Contract Management Agency would go out and sit with contractors and run through the pages and pages and pages of contract clauses, which always blew my mind, right? We've got this entire program around one clause, now, 3-4 clauses. But there's so many hundreds of clauses that they go through in contract management and say, are you doing this one? Are you doing this one? Right. And now this one has expanded. So the government, when they track compliance with government systems, they use a system called EMAS. They are using a version of that also now with CMMC to kind of track certifications, those types of things. And SPRS is kind of the self-hosted, self-reporting. Here's how the government will track your compliance.
SPRS is for the company. EMAS is where the assessor will upload the validated document that you are certified, so defense contractor or contracting officers can see that, yes, you checked the box, you did a good job, you are certified to level 2 or eventually level 3 as part of that. SPRS will be where you're self-assess level 1 and level 2, if those are applicable to you. And that's when we talk about False Claims Act, that's the company putting in a score that's inaccurate. And guess who doesn't like that? The DoD, because you lied to them about how cyber secure you are. And the DOJ likes lawsuits. Who would have thought it? And they want to come after you and take money for misrepresenting your cyber score to the DoD and the federal government as a whole. And they will take your money. I mean, I think we heard at CS2 through a whistleblower attorney that there's over 100 pending cases for whistleblowing, aka somebody put the wrong score in SPRS. So 2 things. If you're an IT person listening to this, do not upload the score. That is not your job. Give it to a senior official in the organization to do the upload. That's a little bit of CYA advice for you out there. So got a couple other questions that hopped in here. Lots of our users work with AutoCAD type software requiring licenses. Can we punch a hole into our licensing server on the commercial side from our GCC enclave? Both are in Azure. Not a problem. Caleb, would you deem this an external connection? Since there's no CUI passing through, you're just poking a hole in to just route the network traffic for licensing activation, and neither the other 2 worlds shall meet. So
yeah, I still consider it an external connection. Is kind of the epitome of an external connection, right? You're not saying you're bringing it into scope as one of the asset types, but the intent of the external connections is you have your secure boundary. What else are you connecting to that's outside of that secure boundary, right? So at the very least, it needs to be documented as an external connection.
Perfect. There you go, Cyber Ninja. Hope that helped you there. I think we had a couple other ones. Oh, going back to the ERP that you made earlier here, Caleb. We have an ERP GAT. Is that? Let's see. Has links that to documents that are CUI, but doesn't actually store the documents. I say this is in scope. Someone internally was trying to say that it's not. Great question. So we refer to this as backlinking. So if you have an ERP system that has a link to where CUI is sitting, right? Let's say it's in an enclave. Does the link itself constitute as making that asset, aka the ERP system, in scope for CUI? And the answer to that is no. Just because you're pointing to where CUI is, if CUI is not being actively processed, stored, or transmitted on that ERP system, that ERP system is actually not in scope, right? So if that link goes back to a enclave or a file share as part of your CUI boundary, then those assets have to be protected accordingly. But just because you are showing a link inside of a system that points to CUI does not mean that ERP or that system actually processes, stores, or transmits CUI. That's a very good question and commonly misunderstood. Just because you're, backlinking doesn't mean that asset's in scope. Anything to add there, Caleb?
Just to reiterate, changing some things within data that is CUI does not make it not CUI, right? So the most common with that, right, is we do the same things and is specific to military or space applications. We still do things the same way, and part numbers and specs and things go through our ERP system for people to utilize, but we don't say what it's tied to. So now it's not CUI anymore, and it is still CUI. Those specs, those things are what the CUI is, right? So you don't necessarily have to know what something is going to be a part of or who's buying it for CUI to still be CUI. That's what I see a lot with ERP systems.
By the way, Wendy in here, SPRS stress professionals reporting stuff. We got a couple of good ones. Still processing risky stuff. I love it. All of the SPRS things. Rich asked this question: does the DoD, DOJ spot check SPURS scores, or is it only by report? That's a good question. So I remember asking, who was it? John Ellis, maybe back in the day, director of DIBCAC. It's like, how do you do it? How do you pick? And it's basically the programs that people are under are kind of deemed high risk, or some of the contracts, and that's kind of their initial target. But then once the DFARS 7019 and 20 kind of went into full effect, they started looking at people with perfect 110 scores as kind of their placemat of, hey, we know in reality that like 99% of you that are reporting a 110 are not accurate. Either you didn't do the scoring based on assessment objectives, or you just lied altogether. And so I remember back, this was probably 2 or 3 years ago, he was like, we're going to start targeting the perfect score companies because we know with high confidence that they probably have a score that's not 110, that's probably closer to negative 203, but didn't want to look bad to the DoD and jeopardize any contracts, even though that wasn't even on the table at the time. So anyways, very, very good question, Rich. I'm not aware that the DOJ has any access to that reporting system. The DoD and DIBCAC and DCMA does. And then they pass along, from what I'm told, if they find someone who has lied, they can pass along that information to the DOJ for them to do what they desire. Or if a whistleblower comes from one of these companies, they can go direct to the DOJ there as well. Man, some really good questions. Andrew, this is a question I've actually been curious on here, Caleb.
Uh-oh.
How about a good description on what the baseline difference is between FedRAMP moderate and FedRAMP high? I was under the impression that it hangs on DFARS.
No. So FedRAMP moderate, it's really just the baselines, right? How many security controls you have to put in place. And then some of the parameters that are prescribed by FedRAMP and also by the DoD program, which they conveniently left out of the 7012 FedRAMP requirements. We won't dive into that, but it's really just a difference in the controls. I think the moderate, at one point, I haven't looked back at it since the Rev 5 difference, but moderate was somewhere around 325 controls. And then the high is closer to the 500 control range. Yeah. So there's just more things, more controls and control enhancements, right? Which is kind of, if we're looking at 800.171 and CMMC level 2 to level 3, the 800.172 is enhancements, right? So all of the control numbers are going to coordinate to something back in 800.171 to say, all right, well, we're limiting access to authorized users. In 172, we're going to now enhance how we do that, right? And get a little more prescriptive and put more serious controls around that.
I love it. We got another one that just popped in here from Michael. If an MSP has a commercial M365 tenant and wants to create a partner relationship with a customer that's using a GCC high tenant to enable more efficient tenant management, is this possible allowed? For example, be able to log into the admin portal using their existing M365 credentials instead of creating a lot of duplicate accounts. Michael, I wish this was possible. GCC High isn't a sovereign cloud and doesn't have the same partner system as like a commercial instance does through traditional CSP means. So even if they wanted to, that bridge and that kind of traditional handshake is not there, sadly. It's one of the reasons that for our managed service team, we have to provision named privileged accounts in our clients' tenants at this time. We have been in conversation with Microsoft to try and at least get the ability for a gov tenant and a gov tenant to do this type of partnership from an administration perspective. There's certain possibilities of that through Azure Lighthouse, but it's not fully baked for full administrative management of multiple tenants. So sadly, it's not possible. I wish it was. It would save you cost on licensing, and it would allow them to more centrally manage and offboard users in a central way if somebody were to leave the MSP. Sadly, it's still just a little bit manual now. All right, man, we're getting some good ones today.
Good ones.
Let's see. I think I had a couple of spicy ones for you. Let's see. Oh yeah. The asset type that will not die. CRMAs, contractor risk managed assets. The loose definition of this is an asset that sits around CUI, but doesn't actually process, store, or transmit CUI, right? So an easy way to think of this might be like a receptionist computer sitting on the same network that CUI sits on, right? The receptionist computer, the administrative assistant, probably never, ever, ever gonna process, store, or transmit CUI, but they're around CUI in the boundary, right? So there's this kind of back and forth debate, and I know, Caleb, you've been having this internally on, do all 110 controls have to be applied, or do they only have to be applied if the security policy stated for that CRMA is insufficient? What are some conclusions that you've drawn around, do I have to implement all 110? Can I just have a security policy? Where does the line mix? Where does it blur? Fire away, my friend.
I will give you my take, which has been again, very heated debates around internally with my team at work, internally with my wife at home, who also happens to be a lead CCA.
Yeah, what are the odds of that, by the way? 2 CCAs living in the same house? That's gotta have some fun, dinner time conversation there.
It's things like this, right? Do CRMAs have to have? I think we both have LinkedIn posts on it that say, the opposite of what each other were saying. The most recent example that I brought up and kind of to drive my side of the debate, right, was what about people, right? You could have people that should be considered CRMAs, right? They're in a space where they could have access to CUI, but they're not supposed to have access to CUI, right? So I would call those a people CRMA asset. Do they have to go through all the CUI training, right? Are they subject to the same policies about specifically handling a CUI? I don't think they should be, right? That's time, that's investment. And we take it back on the technical side, the way I read the rule in how the government is handling it, we see that CRMAs don't exist at level 3, right?
They also don't exist under DIBCAC assessments either. This is a
No.
CMMC specific classification,
This
so
is one
everyone's
of the
aware.
things that I hate most about the scoping guide in general, right? I think the cry from industry when the scoping guide was being made was, tell us how we're supposed to deal with operational technology. And it was responded to with, here's a bunch of categorizations of assets that kind of change everything we're looking at, right? DIBCAC it's got CUI and it's in scope, or is protecting CUI, and we're going to look at how it protects CUI, or we don't care, right? Those are your three categories. It has CUI, is protecting CUI, or we don't care. And that's kind of how I see CRMAs still today, right? I think they should be out of scope. I don't think CMMC particularly cares to have those assets meet all of the requirements. And essentially, what it's saying is, you have to go through and put policies and processes in place to keep CUI from getting to those assets, right? That's the intent. You don't want CUI to go where it's not supposed to. If that happens, sure, you have a break in your system. But it shouldn't really be assessed. And if you're not going to assess it, why bother? Is one, right? It's not a great way to look at it. But if you essentially, we're looking at protecting CUI, right? We want to protect CUI. And if we're keeping CUI away from those assets, why do we need to go through and protect them? I think it goes against the concept of confidentiality specifically when we start getting into the security risks that those pose to the greater system. The other side of the debate, of course, is it comes down to the scoping guide verbiage that says prepare to be assessed against CMMC level 2 security requirements. And that's what kind of everybody is hanging on, is you're still supposed to prepare them to be assessed against the requirements. However, 3.12.4, documenting them in the SSP, is a security requirement of CMMC level 2. So maybe you are doing that by just documenting them properly. And maybe you're not. But I don't think they have to meet the 110 controls if they're a CRMA. I think you have to document them, and that's the extent of your responsibility. There are many people, both internally and externally, that do not agree with that at all.
I'm curious. You've done a lot of assessments under CMMC at this point, and your team has too. How many companies are actually using this asset type? Is it rare? Is it pretty common that people are starting to sprinkle it in? What are some use cases that seem to be validated by this asset type?
So it is, I think it's becoming more rare, right? I think when the scoping guide first came out and it was trying to be understood, there were a lot of debates around this same topic. But essentially, the understanding was, if something is a CRMA, I don't have to have it assessed, right? So I think there was a lot of use of that to say, well, let's call this a CRMA, and we don't have to worry about it. I think it is used because you're inevitably going to have systems that support your business processes that are not specifically geared toward supporting CUI specifically. If you're not doing an enclave, right? You might have an enclave that is purpose built for CUI. But if you're looking at the enterprise level, you're going to have business systems. They're not going to be intended to have CUI or to support protecting CUI, but they are still part of that system. So you really have no choice but to call them a CRMA at that point. But I think it is being used less. Generally the path that a lot of companies are taking is just have them assessed as CUI assets, right? Because a lot of organizations are protecting them with 110 controls anyway. So if you're doing that, no harm, no foul, and your certification covers a larger scope, right? You can do more things.
So Wendy had some extra context to the CRMA. Here's an example. So a machine shop that is building something that is considered CUI, like a flat sheet of metal, a specific thickness, could be CRMA. The thing could be CRMA. I don't think it's usually technology people and places, right? Like facilities and things of that nature. I don't think we necessarily have to go as far as the maybe individual products for asset classification. That would be an interesting conversation, honestly, because CUI, a physical thing could be CUI if you can construe kind of the CUI-ness from that specific artifact or material or whatever it might be. Outside of that, I haven't seen other asset types fit products, like a sheet of metal, for example. It's an interesting question, though. Oh, the machine shop would be CRMA. Yeah, I mean, if it's not supposed to process, store, transmit CUI, and the thing isn't CUI, then yeah, I mean, they could technically have that. The question is that you're probably better off doing specialized assets in that world, just because you can define some sort of security policy. It doesn't have to be aligned to the 110. That's interesting. That's a good question, Wendy. Good thought.
Yeah. Depends on what you're using there too, right? Like if you're clearly processing CUI in that place, unless you're doing specialized assets that can't meet the requirements, then you're probably looking at having a CUI area.
Yeah, but they need the tech specs to build the metal sheet. Yeah, so it's like the tech specs, CUI, sheet of metal, not CUI, and then the world shall collide. All right, this is fun. We got a couple other things here. To Michael's great question about tenant communications outside of administration, is B2B setups a viable option for data exchange and collaboration using services such as Teams and SharePoint? It is. We do a lot of cross-cloud deployments. With everything, there's always gotchas, right? What's your famous saying, Caleb? It's not maybe. It depends. It depends. There we go. The technical bridge between the two for collaboration, yeah, absolutely. GCCI and commercial, GCCI, GCCI, all GCCI, GCC, all the combos you can think of there. The question is, do you have the things and items in place to prevent CUI from being exfiltrated out of your GovCloud CMMC instance into a non-compliant system like commercial, if you're doing cross-cloud between commercial and GCC high? And that's what we talk to a lot of people about. It's like the cross-cloud, relatively easy to set up. The data governance and tagging and DLP policies to make sure are in place. Those are, significantly more work. But then even on top of that, you need to work with your supply chain program so that they understand who you need to collaborate with to make sure that they have contractually flowed down the DFARS clause, and that the company you're trying to work with on like CUI and things like that is actually attesting to their own compliance, right? Because that's where the rub gets, right? Just like CMMC is going to be a flow down requirement, DFARS 7012 is a flow down requirement, and you need to make sure that those suppliers you're trying to collaborate with, prime to sub or sub to sub, you just need to make sure that the supply chain risk department's included for registering those users and approving them, and that you have the governance in place that you're not sharing CUI with companies that aren't approved to receive CUI. All right. I'm going to go bounce back over here. Again, you and your team have done a lot of assessments. Yes. I would feel I would not have done this live stream a good service today if I did not ask you, what are some pitfalls that you're seeing after having 29 CMMC certs under your belt, that you are so happy that either A, you spent more time on, the client spent more time on? What are some pitfalls that people need to look out for before entering into their CMMC certification?
Well, that is one of the main things, right, is time. We've seen a number, right? It's not recommended, just because you have the CMMC requirement, to go out and schedule a C3PAO assessment and get it on the books when you have no idea whether you're compliant or not, right? Same thing as
that seems a little problematic, doesn't it?
It seems so, but it happens all the time. all the time, right? They're like, well, I've got the requirement. I need to do it by this time. I'm going to go ahead and schedule an assessment. That way I can get my certification. It's going to be difficult to get in and make sure everything gets done if you put yourself on a short timeline. Now, if you have an expectation and you've kind of looked at things, you've done an internal assessment, you have ideas on, what needs to be done to get you to the finish line, and then you're planning out that time and say, I think we can do an assessment around this time. Great. But the same as earlier, when I talk about the ESPs, and well, this one says 100% inheritance, and this one says 80% inheritance. A lot of organizations are just looking at that and saying, like you said earlier, right? We've got 29 assessments under our belt. And so the thought is, well, I can just go sign up with Summit 7 and sign up for an assessment, and that's all I need to do.
That's right. Those are the only 2 check boxes I need, right?
Yeah. Time doesn't matter. Looking at it doesn't matter. But that I think is going to be one of the biggest ones. The second biggest one I would say is actually understanding and preparing. So there's numerous types of assessments, right? Internal assessments, gap assessments, mock assessments that you can get with experts to do and actually walk through. What I've seen a lot of companies fall into is they are working with providers and assuming that the provider has it all covered. An assessor is still going to ask you questions for your certification, right? You're being assessed. Your organization is being assessed. A good ESP might be able to help you get through that assessment. I know we do a great deal of helping for our clients. There are MSPs that don't do that. And, we get into kind of one of the things in the rule and the cap that came out was, well, ESPs are still expected to show up for interviews, whether they're certified, whether they've got this, whether they've got that. That is kind of like the FedRAMP requirement in the 7012, where it's not a requirement that the MSP is obligated to, right? It is a requirement that the OSC or the OSA is obligated to use an organization that's going to do that. Also, on the back end of that, if you're using an MSP, but you can go through and speak to and show everything that MSP is doing, an assessor doesn't care who's giving them the information as long as you're proving it, right? So over-reliance on ESPs is a big one, and just lack of taking the time to get in and really prepare.
Makes sense, because I can't tell you how many people come to our front door and they're like, all right, Daniel, I'm going to buy an enclave from you, and I'm going to schedule my assessment from 4 months from now.
I've already scheduled my assessment for 4 months.
I've already scheduled my assessment. It's like, we probably need to, dial that in just a little bit more, right? Because it's one of those things where people look at CMMC as a burden. And I understand why, right? I'm not, immune to that. I know it's a significant cost to the organization, but in reality, it's not your data. It's the DoD's data, and this is how they want you to protect it, right? And on the other side of that, it's like people are wrestling with, oh, I thought if I just did this thing and checked these 2 boxes, I would be good. It's like, no, you're changing, in all reality, the way that the organization operates or anything related to defense in most cases, right? Assuming you're not doing a bunch of COTS stuff. But anyways, very, very interesting. Like when you start going down that, it's like, you really need to make sure, again, this is not an IT problem. IT will go out and get an enclave built and check that box. However, you will still fail an assessment if you just buy like a enclave subscription, enclave as a service, if you will, if you do not have the true organizational buy-in, scope, data flow, et cetera, as part of that as well. There's some interesting conversations going on kind of in the chat here about CUI. Basically, is physical item CUI. And it comes down to, if you can derive information from said physical items that is controlled unclassified information, then yes, right? If you can't, well, then you can't, right? So I mean, that's fairly straightforward in that world. So anyway, it's really good kind of back and forth between John and Bruce here in the chat as well. All right, couple of very unique controls here. 3.3.7, authoritative time source. Can it be internal, like a Windows NTP server? Or does it have to be external? What's kind of, you mentioned there was some debate going around this. I would think that either would be okay. Is there some secret voodoo language in like the discussion of the CMMC control, or what's the active debate here?
Yes and no. So the active debate is what constitutes authoritative time source, right? I know a lot of my team is watching. We've been having heated discussion back and forth with one another, as we like to do. Really the discussion does talk about being expressed in UTC and having that kind of external connection. What we typically see, right, is going to be domain joined systems, and the domain controller is going to sync with that external time source, right? It's something authoritative. One of the arguments that was made, right, is that for this requirement in particular, which is saying essentially your timestamps for audit logs need to be accurate, kind of across your system. And so if you have an internal NTP server that everything is syncing to, whether that one is synced to an authoritative time source externally could be irrelevant in the spirit of the control overall. The opposite side of that debate is, all of your systems might not be just on that internal system.
Mm-hmm.
So one that was brought up by Carly Logan on our team was, if you've got things that are also in Microsoft Cloud and you're using box.com, and you've got all these different things that are kind of interconnected but still separate systems, and you're trying to track down an incident, and you've got all your internal systems using just this NTP server that's not actually synced to an authoritative time source, that's not going to bode well for forensics and things.
Right. If Box has a different timestamp than internal workstation login when you're trying to correlate who did what, that's problematic. Yeah.
And so we like to use other references and things when we debate. So we look at like 853 and Rev 3 of the 800-171. And that one actually has an ODP defined for syncing to something that is an external authoritative time source, something that is based on UTC, or like the Stratum one, time.windows.com. There's NIST ones. So yeah, I think overall the end result answer that we kind of came up with is that you do need that authoritative time source, and a single server without being synced to something authoritative is not authoritative.
Very interesting. So if I had a server with no connection to the internet and it was the thing deriving the time and the BIOS battery was running slow, I would have a problem passing an assessment. Especially when that's not the only source of logs, right? Because you would use logs external to that in most cases with all the cloud providers and all the other fun things.
There is an additional argument on that, right? Of, well, if an assessor sees that you have an NTP server, they're probably not going to go farther than that. So kind of like I was saying with CRMAs earlier, is it really that important if the assessor's not going to look at it? But there are people that think about it, right? And an assessor can go further with it if they want to.
And to Jason's point, pointing back to 853, the Godfather document is very helpful whenever you have confusion around controls to see what the intent of that control actually was, because you'll get way better context from NIST 853 in most cases than you will straight from just the 171, just because sometimes things are complicated and fun like that, aren't they, Caleb?
Yes, they are.
We have another one, session termination 3.1.11. This is also somewhat of a recently debated control. Is a session lock of a user on a VDI, on a workstation, is that sufficient to be deemed a termination? Or does it have to go as far as actually ending the session, meaning nothing is actually running under that, I'll call it hibernating profile, right? When the session lock actually happens. What's the lay of the land when it comes to this control?
So this one is an ongoing, still currently as we speak, ongoing debate. So it's not really fair. I get a platform to, express my side.
I'm just saying, I'll try and play devil's advocate here. So I'll let you give your pitch and I'll try and embody your team and counter arguments here.
So in my years of doing assessments, 6 years for now, and observing assessments and preparing for assessments, 3.1.10, right, preceding this control, is to have a session lockout with an inactivity timeout.
Okay.
It is very often used, that same inactivity timeout with a session lock is used to answer 3.1.11 because you've already answered it. And then you're like,
kind of building on top of each other at that point.
Yeah. So you say, well, you have to define the conditions. Condition is going to be a timeout. And then it's automatically terminated after the conditions occur. So you've already shown that that timeout, inactivity timeout is set. It works. And now you've met 2 controls. The debate is coming, if you scroll down to the discussion section there, is whether that session lock actually is conducive of a termination, right? So we see they kind of have a definition in their session termination: terminates all processes associated with a user's logical session, except those that are specifically created by the user to continue after the session is terminated. I have never, Daniel, never seen an assessor have an issue with saying the inactivity timeout with the screen lock is sufficient for 3.1.11. However,
never,
ever. I don't know if I'm not going to speak in all caps for sake of your eardrums, but really the argument that's being made is that session lock, whether it actually constitutes a termination. I say that it does. There's been very good points made to counter that, right? And there's really kind of these 3 controls. And again, we go to the 800-171 Rev 3 ODPs. They talk about here in the discussion from the 171 from NIST, says things like an inactivity timeout can be used. So I don't think that's so much in debate, but it's more of what happens at the end of that inactivity timeout. So in order for this to be met, we're looking at things like user should log out, system reboots, things of that nature are causing an actual termination of the session. So it's like, after that inactivity timeout, do we need to have the user log out? Do we need to force a reboot, right? Or do you just define conditions like system log out and reboot or maintenance window, things of that nature?
I kind of lean, I hate to not play devil's advocate, but I kind of lean towards you, right? It's like, if we're defining, and this is the tricky part about discussions. Jacob and I on the live stream a few weeks ago were talking about, is it required to have a system fully patched in order to pass CMMC, or on a current supported version was, I think, the actual question. And in the discussion, it gives examples that would lead you to say, yes, it needs to be. However, the discussion is not the assessment objectives. It's just conceptually some thoughts around it. And so this is where it gets very different, very difficult. And to Dustin's point here, should we set expectations? There could be different interpretations between the lead CCA and CCAs on the assessment. Ideally, there's alignment going on about kind of a general acceptance of the control and how it's supposed to be met prior to going into your assessment. But yeah, I mean, you're seeing it right here. Like, we have a team of the most qualified, competent, with years of past performance. And there's still things that are brought up for discussion around how exactly can this be assessed? How should it be assessed? ODPs will help that in Rev 3 because they're very prescriptive, right? It's like you either do this or you don't do this. But yeah, I mean, I'm kind of with you. Like, I wouldn't lean so heavily on the discussion. I would definitely lean back to conditions requiring a user session to terminate are defined, AKA after 10 minutes of inactivity, right? Or 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And then a user session is automatically terminated after that defined condition. If I can justify that I'm meeting those two things, but it might contradict with some things in the discussion, I think I'm okay. I think it's okay to say that the discussion's just some good ideas. Sometimes they're not even that good, but they're just general ideas on how you might be able to meet the control and assessment objective, but doesn't exactly mean you have to do it that way. And a lot of people get hung up that are new to CMMC and new to NIST, that they think the discussion is the prescriptive way that it has to be done. And it's a good question to ask your assessors, your C3POs that you're interviewing. Do you believe the discussion is Bible, is gospel, or are you okay with us being able to justify how we're meeting it at just the assessment objective level? And I think that's really kind of important for everyone kind of here listening to make sure that they're validating with the assessors that they're working with. So.
Yeah, we had part of that discussion earlier too, well, I thought the discussion wasn't prescriptive. And I said, it's not prescriptive because it's not prescriptive. You don't have to do things that it says in there as examples. But it is authoritative guidance from NIST on how that can help you interpret what the requirement is asking for.
Yep, absolutely. And on that fun and last note of debating and arguing controls, and you can see, guys, like, if people think, oh, you get your CCA, it's brought clear how to interpret every single control, right? FYI, not the case. If anything, sometimes I would say it leads to more questions, doesn't it, Caleb? And so, just because someone has a CCA doesn't mean that doesn't mean they're automatically interpreting every control correctly. And, getting some of the gotchas out of the way in your interview process with C3POs is really important to make sure you have almost like a preliminary alignment on the gotcha controls, we'll call them, before you realize that they think the discussion is gospel and they have to be prescribed exactly like that, right? Anyways, Caleb, thanks for joining, my friend. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. We'll have to do this again. Hearing from an assessor is very refreshing because Jacob and I just play one on TV. And so, yeah, it's nice to have someone who actually knows what they're doing here. So thanks for everyone for tuning in. For the questions we didn't get to, we'll save some of those for next week. And everybody have a great weekend. See y'all.
See you guys.